The autumn wind carried dust and whispers through the streets of Cedar Ridge, a town carved from stubborn prairie grass and harder men's dreams. Population barely 500 souls, it sat like a weathered stone in the vast Wyoming territory, where law meant what the strongest man said it meant, and a woman's place was wherever her father or husband decreed. From the second-story window of the largest house in town, Emily Carter watched the sun sink behind the distant mountains. Her fingers traced patterns in the window's condensation, each movement deliberate and slow, as if she could delay the inevitable by stretching these final moments of solitude. "Emily!" Her father's voice cut through the house like a bullwhip. "Downstairs, now!" She didn't hurry. 22 years of living under Samuel Carter's roof had taught her that defiance came in many forms. Sometimes it was as simple as taking 30 seconds longer to descend the stairs, letting each step creak beneath her weight, letting him hear her measured disobedience. The parlor smelled of tobacco and leather, her father's two constants. Samuel Carter stood before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, studying the flames as if they held the secrets to taming his wayward daughter. He was a man built like the land itself, harsh angles and unforgiving lines, weathered by decades of bending others to his will. "You've refused Harrison's proposal." It wasn't a question. "I have." Emily kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled where she hid them in the folds of her blue calico dress. "That's the third respectable offer this year." Respectable. She tasted the word like bitter medicine. "Is that what we call it when a man old enough to be my grandfather wants to add me to his collection of possessions?" Samuel's jaw tightened. In the firelight, his shadow stretched across the room like a living thing. "Harrison owns half the cattle in 3 counties. His first wife bore him 4 sons before she passed. He's offering you security, status. A prison with silk curtains is still a prison. Father—" The slap came fast, but Emily had learned to see it coming in the way his shoulders shifted. She turned her face just enough to lessen the impact, though her cheek still blazed with heat. She didn't touch it. That would be admitting defeat. "You think you're clever." Samuel's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet that preceded storms. "You think your books and your ideas make you special. But I know what you are. Emily, you're a woman who's forgotten her place." The front door opened, bringing a gust of cool air and the sound of spurred boots. Thomas, her younger brother, appeared in the doorway. At 19, he already carried himself with their father's swagger, though his face still held traces of the boy who once brought her wildflowers. "Father." Thomas nodded, then glanced at Emily. Something flickered in his eyes, not quite sympathy, but close enough to make her chest tighten. "Judge Morrison's here. Says it's urgent." Judge Morrison filled the doorframe like a monument to frontier justice. His black coat hung heavy with authority, and his eyes held all the warmth of January ice. Behind him stood Sheriff Daniels, hand resting casual-like on his pistol, though everyone knew there was nothing casual about it. "Samuel." The judge's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I hear you're having trouble with your daughter." Emily's stomach dropped. In Cedar Ridge, when the law got involved in family matters, it never boded well for the woman. "Nothing I can't handle. Josiah." But Samuel's tone suggested otherwise. "See, that's where you're wrong." Judge Morrison stepped into the room, bringing the smell of horse and leather and something else, the metallic scent of impending judgment. "Your daughter's refusal to marry is becoming disruptive. The Harrison boy's talking about taking his business to Cheyenne. Says if Cedar Ridge can't keep its women in line, maybe it's not the place for ambitious men." "She'll come around." "No." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "She won't, which is why I'm here with a solution." Emily found her voice. "I have rights." The judge's laugh was like gravel grinding. "Rights, Miss Carter. You have what we give you. Nothing more." He turned back to Samuel. "The town council met this morning. We've decided to invoke Article 7. The room went cold. Emily had heard of Article 7, a local ordinance written in the early days of the territory. a law that gave fathers and town authorities the power to arrange marriages for wayward women who threatened the community's stability. It hadn't been used in years, considered too harsh even for Cedar Ridge. "You can't," the words escaped before she could stop them. "Can't I?" Judge Morrison pulled a document from his coat. "Emily Margaret Carter, you are hereby ordered to marry within 7 days. The choice of husband." He paused, savoring the moment. "Well, that's where it gets interesting." Samuel leaned forward. "Harrison's still willing." "No." The judge's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. "She's refused respectable men, so she'll marry whoever's willing to take her. Could be the lowest man in town. Could be a drifter passing through. Hell, could be someone from the servant quarters. First man to speak up and claim her. That's who she'll wed." The color drained from Samuel's face. "Josiah, be reasonable. She's my daughter. Should have thought of that before you let her run wild." The judge folded the document with deliberate care. "Announcement will be posted tomorrow morning. Any man, and I do mean any man, can claim her. Once someone does, the marriage happens within 24 hours." Emily's knees threatened to buckle, but she locked them straight. Around her, the room seemed to spin. This wasn't just punishment, it was complete humiliation. Her father's status wouldn't protect her. She could end up married to anyone. The drunk who slept behind the saloon. The elderly widower who muttered to himself on street corners. Anyone. "Please." The word tasted like ashes, but she forced it out. "I'll consider Harrison's proposal. Too late for that, girl." Sheriff Daniels spoke for the first time, tobacco juice staining his words brown. "Judge's decision is final. Maybe next time a woman in this town thinks about getting uppity, she'll remember what happened to Emily Carter." They left as suddenly as they'd come, taking the last of Emily's freedom with them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas shifted by the door, looking like he wanted to speak but didn't dare. Samuel stared at the fire, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "This is your fault," he finally said, not looking at her. "Your pride, your stubbornness. Now look what you've brought on us. On our name." Emily straightened her spine, calling on reserves of strength she wasn't sure existed. "You agreed to this. You let them get out of my sight." His voice was tired now, old. "You have 7 days. Use them to pray someone decent takes pity on you." She climbed the stairs on legs that felt like water. Behind her, she heard Thomas whisper something to their father, heard Samuel's sharp response. But the words blurred together, meaningless noise in a world suddenly gone mad. In her room, Emily didn't light the lamp. She sat on her bed, hands folded in her lap, and stared at the darkness gathering outside her window. Somewhere in town, men were probably already discussing her fate, weighing her father's wealth against the shame of marrying a disgraced woman, calculating what they might gain from claiming Samuel Carter's daughter. The wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeleton fingers tapping for entry. Emily closed her eyes and tried to imagine her future, but all she saw was darkness. Tomorrow, the announcement would be posted. Tomorrow, her fate would be written in the crude handwriting of whoever dared to claim her. In the distance, a coyote howled, lonely and defiant against the dying light. Emily understood the feeling. She was about to become prey in a game where the rules were written by men who saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant as the justice in Cedar Ridge. Emily watched them appear, each one a reminder that the world would keep turning, indifferent to the destruction of one woman's life. Tomorrow would come whether she wanted it or not, and with it, the beginning of the end of everything she'd known. The morning came wrapped in frost and dread. Emily stood at her window, watching the crowd gather around the notice board in the town square. Word had spread like wildfire through Cedar Ridge. Samuel Carter's daughter was to be married off to any man who'd claim her. She could see the shapes of people below, some shaking their heads, others laughing. The humiliation burned worse than her father's slap. By noon, no one had stepped forward. The respectable men kept their distance, unwilling to ally themselves with a woman who defied convention. The less respectable ones were likely calculating whether Samuel Carter's money was worth the trouble of a rebellious wife. Emily found herself in a strange purgatory, both relieved and terrified as each hour passed. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Martha, their housekeeper, had tried bringing food, but Emily couldn't stomach it. The older woman's eyes held pity that made everything worse. "You should prepare yourself," Martha said softly, setting down fresh water. "Whatever happens, you'll need strength." It was near sunset when the commotion started. Emily heard raised voices from the street, her father's among them. Her hands trembled as she moved to the window. A crowd had formed near their front gate, and in the center stood Judge Morrison with his eternal document. Then she saw him. Daniel Hayes stood apart from the crowd, still wearing his work clothes from the stables. Dust covered his boots, and his brown hat was pulled low, but he stood straight, shoulders square. Emily knew him by sight. Everyone knew the Carter's stable hand. He was the one who gentled the difficult horses, who worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, the one who kept his eyes down when the family passed. "This is absurd," Samuel's voice carried clear. "He's a servant, a nobody." Judge Morrison's response was calm, implacable. "The law says any man. Hayes here has spoken his claim, unless someone else steps forward in the next minute." Emily watched her father's face cycle through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. He looked around wildly, as if hoping anyone else would speak. But the crowd remained silent. Even Thomas, standing on the porch, said nothing. "Time's up." The judge's pronouncement fell like an executioner's axe. "The marriage will take place tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Sharp." The crowd began to disperse, voices buzzing with scandal. Emily saw her father grab Daniel's arm, saw him speak urgently, gesturing, but Daniel simply shook his head, tipped his hat, and walked away. The die was cast. That night, Emily barely slept. She'd exchanged one prison for another, but what kind? She knew almost nothing about Daniel Hayes except that he was quiet, competent, and somewhere near 30 years old. He'd worked for them for 3 years, but she could count on one hand the times they'd spoken. What possessed him to claim her? Surely not affection. They were strangers. Money. He had to know her father would never give a dowry to a stable hand. Dawn came too soon. Martha arrived with Emily's best dress, a bitter irony, wearing finery to marry a servant. The blue wool was the color of spring sky, with tiny pearl buttons her mother had sewn before she died. Emily's fingers shook as she fastened them. "He's a good man," Martha said suddenly, helping with Emily's hair. "Daniel Hayes, I've seen how he treats the animals. Gentle, patient." Emily met her eyes in the mirror. "You know him. We all know each other. Miss, the servants, he keeps to himself mostly, but he's helped many of us when we needed it. Never asks for anything back." It was thin comfort, but Emily clung to it as she descended the stairs. Her father waited in the parlor, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Thomas stood by the window, refusing to meet her eyes. "It's not too late," Samuel said. "I could speak to Morrison. Perhaps if you publicly apologized, agreed to Harrison's—" "No." Emily surprised herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'll honor the law's decision." Something flickered across her father's face, respect or disappointment. She couldn't tell. "Then you're no daughter of mine. After today, you're dead to this family." The words should have hurt more than they did. Perhaps she'd used up her capacity for pain. Emily simply nodded and walked past him, out the door, into the cruel, bright morning of her wedding day. The church was nearly empty. Judge Morrison stood at the altar with Reverend Mills, who looked deeply uncomfortable. A handful of townspeople occupied the back pews, witnesses to the spectacle, and there, near the front, stood Daniel Hayes. He'd tried to clean up. His dark suit was old but carefully brushed, his boots polished. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw and features that were pleasant if unremarkable. When Emily approached, he looked at her directly for perhaps the first time, and she was startled by his eyes, gray like storm clouds, steady and unreadable. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. Reverend Mills stumbled over the words as if they burned his tongue. There were no flowers, no music, no joy, just the legal binding of two strangers while the town watched. "Do you, Daniel James Hayes, take this woman?" His "I do" was quiet but clear. "Do you, Emily Margaret Carter, take this man?" Emily felt the weight of everyone waiting for her to refuse, to break down, to beg. Instead, she looked at Daniel and spoke the words that would change everything. "I do." There was no kiss. Daniel simply offered his arm, and she took it. Together they walked down the aisle and out into the harsh sunlight. A small wagon waited, loaded with what looked like all of Daniel's possessions, precious little for a lifetime of work. "Your things?" he asked, speaking to her directly for the first time. "I have nothing." It was true. Her father had made it clear she left with only what she wore. Daniel nodded as if this was expected. He helped her onto the wagon seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her. As they pulled away, Emily didn't look back at her father's house. That life was dead. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than what she left behind. They rode in silence through town, past the staring faces and pointing fingers. Emily kept her chin high, though each look felt like a stone thrown. Beside her, Daniel seemed unbothered by the attention, handling the horses with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. His home, their home now, sat 2 miles outside town. Emily had expected a shack, maybe a converted barn. Instead, she found a small but solid cabin, built with care if not wealth. A vegetable garden struggled against the autumn frost. A lean-to sheltered split wood. Everything spoke of a man who worked hard and wasted nothing. Daniel helped her down, then stood awkwardly, as if unsure what came next. "It's not much," he said finally, "but the roof doesn't leak and the stove draws well." Emily looked at the cabin, at the man who was now her husband, at the life she'd never imagined. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why did you claim me?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Seemed wrong, what they were doing, making you a prize for any man to grab. You deserved better. So you grabbed me instead." "I spoke for you," he corrected gently. "There's a difference. You'll have a roof, food, safety. Beyond that," he shrugged, "we'll figure it out as we go." He carried his few belongings inside, leaving Emily standing in the yard. The wind tugged at her fine dress, reminding her how out of place she was. But as she watched Daniel move about, preparing the cabin for 2 instead of 1, she noticed something. He'd cleared out the main room, giving her the bed while setting up a pallet in the loft for himself. Fresh water waited in a pitcher. A woman's shawl, where had he gotten it, lay folded on the bed. Small gestures, thoughtful ones, from a man she dismissed as a servant without ever really seeing him. Emily took a breath, picked up her skirts, and stepped through the doorway of her new life. Behind her, the sun was setting on everything she'd known. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and a marriage built on necessity rather than love. But for the first time since Judge Morrison had pronounced her fate, Emily felt something besides despair. It might have been hope. Fragile as frost, but just as real. Daniel Hayes had given her what no one else would, the possibility of building something new from the ashes of her old life. As darkness fell on that first night, they moved carefully around each other. 2 strangers bound by law and circumstance. But stranger things had grown in the harsh soil of the frontier. Perhaps, given time and patience, something unexpected might take root here too. The coyotes howled in the distance, but inside the small cabin, The stove gave warmth, and the silence between them felt less like emptiness and more like potential. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, it was enough to have shelter from the storm. The first morning arrived with a rooster's crow from somewhere distant and the unfamiliar smell of wood smoke. Emily woke disoriented, her body stiff from sleeping in her corset and chemise. She'd had nothing else to change into. The cabin was cold, but she could hear movement below, the careful sounds of someone trying not to wake her. She found Daniel by the stove, coaxing life from stubborn kindling. He'd already been outside. His boots were damp with dew. When he noticed her on the ladder, he straightened, seeming unsure whether to acknowledge her presence or continue his task. "Morning," he said finally, turning back to the stove. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it. Privy's out back, about 20 yards past the woodpile." Emily had never used an outdoor privy in her life. At home, her father's house. She corrected herself. They'd had indoor facilities, a luxury in Cedar Ridge, but she merely nodded, grateful he didn't watch her navigate the ladder in her fine dress. The privy was crude but clean. Walking back, Emily took in her surroundings properly for the first time. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed by cottonwoods that whispered secrets to the morning air. Beyond the vegetable garden, prairie stretched endless, broken only by distant mountains. No neighbors in sight. No one to witness her fall from grace except the man who'd caught her. Inside, Daniel had managed to get the stove going. He worked at the small table, slicing bread with careful movements. Emily noticed his hands scarred from work, but clean, methodical in their task. "I don't—" She gestured helplessly at the stove, the kitchen area that might as well have been foreign territory. "I never learned to cook." He glanced at her, and she thought she saw amusement flicker in those storm-gray eyes. "Figured as much. Sit. I'll manage breakfast." She sat, watching him work. He moved with economy, no wasted motion. Soon the smell of toasting bread filled the cabin, along with something else, beans. She realized, heated from last night, her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Daniel set a plate before her. Beans, bread with a scraping of butter, a tin cup of water. Simple fare that would have horrified her father's cook. But Emily ate every bite, surprised by her appetite. "Thank you," she managed when finished. He nodded, already cleaning the dishes in a bucket of water. "There's things you'll need to learn," he said without looking at her. "Can't do everything myself, especially come spring when work picks up." "Teach me." The word surprised them both. Daniel turned, studying her with that steady gaze. "You sure it's not easy work? Nothing like what you're used to?" Emily thought of her father's house, of days spent reading and embroidering, waiting for a life that never came. "What I'm used to is gone. Might as well learn something useful." So began her education. Daniel started with fire, how to bank coals at night, how to coax flame from seemingly dead ash, how to judge the heat for different tasks. Emily's first attempts produced more smoke than warmth, leaving her coughing and teary-eyed while Daniel patiently corrected her technique. "Gentle," he said, guiding her hand with the poker. "Fires like a horse force don't work. Gotta understand what it needs." By noon, Emily had managed to keep the stove steady for an hour. Her dress was streaked with soot, her carefully arranged hair falling loose. When she caught sight of herself in the small mirror by the door, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Water came next. Daniel showed her the well, demonstrated the rhythm of drawing water without tangling the rope. Emily's soft hands blistered immediately, but she bit back complaints. Each bucket was a victory, proof she could survive this life. The afternoon brought wood. Daniel had already split most of what they'd need, but he showed her how to stack it properly, how to choose pieces for different purposes. Pine for starting, oak for lasting, he explained, his voice taking on a teaching rhythm. Always keep some dry inside, no matter what. Emily's back ached, her arms trembled. but she stacked wood until the pile stood neat and ready. Daniel inspected her work with the same care he'd give to a horse's hooves, then nodded approval. Such a small gesture, but Emily felt absurd pride bloom in her chest. Supper was a challenge. Daniel let her try. Standing back as she attempted to replicate his morning routine, the beans scorched, the bread burned on one side, stayed dough on the other. But Daniel ate without comment, and when Emily apologized, he shrugged. "I've eaten worse. Army taught you to be grateful for any hot meal." "You served
3 years. After the war, work was scarce.
Your father paid fair wages,
Didn't ask questions about the past. That was enough."
It was the most he'd said at once. Emily wanted to ask more, but something in his expression suggested the topic was closed. They finished the meal in silence, but it wasn't the oppressive quiet of her father's table. This felt more like rest. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharp. Daniel built up the fire, then gestured to a trunk in the corner.
"Martha Palmer sent this, said you'd need things."
Inside were practical clothes, simple dresses, undergarments, a thick shawl, sturdy boots. Not charity, Emily realized, but kindness from the woman who'd served her family for years. Tears threatened, but she swallowed them back. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'll step out while you change." He left her with the lamp, disappearing into the cold. Emily shed her fine dress quickly, relief flooding through her as she loosened the corset. The new clothes were coarse but clean, sized close enough to fit. The boots felt strange, heavier than her delicate shoes, but they'd keep her feet warm. When Daniel returned, he blinked at the transformation. "Better," was all he said. But Emily caught something in his expression. Not desire, but perhaps approval. The evening routine began. Daniel showed her how to prepare for night banking the fire, securing the door, checking that water buckets were filled. He moved his pallet down from the loft without comment, setting it near the stove.
"You don't have to,"
Emily said awkwardly.
"Sleep down here. I trust."
She trailed off, realizing trust wasn't the right word. She barely knew this man.
"It's warmer,"
Daniel said simply.
"Loft gets cold. This way I can tend the fire at night."
Practical reasons. Safe ones. Emily nodded and retreated to the bed, his bed, which he'd given up without fuss. It smelled of soap and hay. Unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Through the thin walls, she could hear coyotes calling, wind rattling the windows. But inside felt secure, a small circle of warmth in the vast dark. "Daniel," she called softly.
Thank you for today, for teaching me."
Silence. Then,
"You did good. Hands'll toughen up. Rest gets easier."
Emily pulled the rough blanket to her chin, marveling at the strangeness of it all. This morning she'd been Emily Carter, useless ornament in a rich man's house. Tonight she was Emily Hayes, learning to survive by the grace of a quiet man's patience. Her hands throbbed, her back ached, and tomorrow would bring more of the same. But underneath the exhaustion lay something unexpected, satisfaction. She'd kept a fire burning, drawn water, stacked wood. Small victories that meant nothing in her old world but everything in this one. Through the darkness, she could hear Daniel's steady breathing, the occasional shift as he adjusted on the hard floor. He asked for nothing, offered no threats or demands. Just shelter, teaching, and the space to become someone new. The coyotes sang their wild songs, but Emily found them less frightening now. She was learning the language of this harder life, word by painful word. And her teacher, unlikely as he was, seemed willing to let her try. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless. Outside, the prairie wind tested the cabin walls, finding them solid. Inside, two strangers began the slow work of building something neither had expected. Not love, not yet, but perhaps its foundation. Stone by stone, lesson by lesson, day by day. The rooster would crow again tomorrow, and Emily would rise to meet it. Her hands would blister more before they calloused. She'd burn more bread, scorch more beans, but she'd also learn, adapt, survive. For now, that was enough. Winter arrived like a vengeful spirit, howling down from the mountains with teeth of ice and claws of wind. Emily woke to a world transformed. Snow piled against the door. Frost painting fantastic patterns on the windows. The cabin groaned under the weight of winter's first true assault. Daniel was already up, forcing the door open against the drift. Cold air rushed in like a living thing, stealing breath and warmth. He worked quickly, shoveling a path to the woodpile, his movements urgent. "Storm settling in," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Could last days. We need to prepare." Emily had thought she understood cold. She was wrong. This was cold that crept through walls, that turned breathing into clouds, that made her bones ache. Together they worked, hauling extra wood inside, melting snow for water, checking their food supplies. The beans and salt pork that had seemed monotonous now looked precious, finite resources against an uncertain siege. By nightfall, the storm had become a monster. Wind screamed around the cabin like the fury of God himself. Snow fell so thick that the windows became useless, showing only swirling white. Daniel kept the fire burning high, but still the cold pressed in from every corner. "First big storm's always the worst," he said, noting Emily's wide eyes as the cabin shuddered. "Cabin's solid. Built her myself 3 summers back. She'll hold." They ate sparingly that night, cornbread and thin soup, saving the heartier supplies. Emily noticed Daniel gave her the larger portion, though he'd worked harder. When she tried to protest, he simply said, "I'm used to less." Sleep came fitfully. Emily dozed wrapped in every blanket they owned, waking often to the storm's rage. Once, she found Daniel sitting up, feeding the fire, frost glittering in his beard. "Go back to sleep," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." Watch for what? Just watching. But Emily understood. He was standing guard against the night, against the cold that could kill if given the chance. She'd never had anyone keep watch for her before. The storm lasted 4 days. By the second day, they'd established routines. Daniel taught her card games with a worn deck, telling stories of army camps and cattle drives. Emily reciprocated with what she remembered from her books. Poetry, histories, tales from distant places neither of them would see. "You know all that by heart?" Daniel asked after she'd recited a long passage from Shakespeare. "I had little else to do but read," Emily admitted. "Father thought education made women difficult, but Mother insisted, after she died." She shrugged. Books were company. On the 3rd day, they heard something outside, a weak cry, almost lost in the wind. Daniel armed himself with an old rifle and ventured out, returning with a figure so covered in snow it barely looked human. It was Miguel Santos, a Mexican farmer from 2 miles east, his face gray with cold. His wife, Rosa, was in labor. Their cabin had lost part of its roof to the storm. The midwife couldn't reach them. "Please," Miguel gasped through chattering teeth. "She needs help. The baby." Emily felt Daniel's eyes on her. They both knew the danger. Venturing out in this storm could mean death. But they also knew what refusing meant. "I'll go," Daniel said. "No." Emily surprised herself. "We both go. She'll need a woman there." Daniel started to protest, then stopped. Perhaps he saw something in her face, determination that wouldn't be swayed. He nodded once. They prepared quickly. Emily wore everything she could layer, wrapped blankets over that. Daniel rigged a rope between them so they wouldn't lose each other in the white blindness. Then they plunged into the storm. Emily had never known such cold. It burned like fire, stole thought, made every step a battle. Without Daniel's steady presence ahead, pulling her forward, she would have given up within minutes. The world became nothing but white and wind and the rope connecting her to life. The Santos cabin appeared like a ghost from the storm. Half the roof had indeed collapsed, snow pouring in. They found Rosa in the intact corner, deep in labor's grip while trying to keep her 2 young children warm. What followed was the longest night of Emily's life. She'd never attended a birth, but necessity made her midwife. Daniel worked to patch the roof with canvas and boards, fighting the storm for every inch. Emily boiled water, tore sheets for bandages, held Rosa's hands through the pain.
"I can't,"
Rosa gasped in accented English.
"Too tired."
"You can," Emily heard herself say, channeling strength she didn't know she possessed.
"You must. Your children need you."
The baby came with the dawn, tiny, purple, but crying, alive. Emily cleaned him with shaking hands, wrapped him in whatever warmth they could find. Rosa wept with relief and exhaustion. The storm was breaking. Through the patched roof, they could see hints of clearing sky. Daniel had done the impossible, creating shelter from ruins. His hands were raw, face drawn with exhaustion, but he smiled when he saw the baby.
"Miguel owes you his family,"
Emily told him as they prepared to leave. "We both did this," Daniel corrected. "Couldn't have managed without you." The journey home was easier. Stormlight now instead of storm dark. But Emily stumbled often, depleted beyond measure. Finally, Daniel simply picked her up, carrying her the last quarter mile. She should have protested. Instead, she let her head rest against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of wool and snow and safety. Back home, and when had she started thinking of the cabin as home? Daniel tended to her as she'd tended to Rosa. He heated water for her frozen feet, made hot soup, insisted she rest. Emily watched him move about their small space with new eyes. This man who'd claimed her to save her from worse fate, who gave without taking, who'd risked his life for strangers because it was right.
"The town,"
she said suddenly.
"There must be others in trouble. The storm."
Daniel nodded grimly. "Tomorrow, when you're rested, we'll check on folks. But tonight, you need to recover." They spent that evening in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, snow continued to fall, but gently now. The monster had passed, leaving a world transformed but survivable. As Emily drifted towards sleep, she felt Daniel adjust her blankets, checking that she was warm enough. Such a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In her father's house, servants had tended her needs. Here, her husband, strange to think the word, cared for her himself. Not from duty or payment, but from something else. Decency, perhaps. Or maybe something deeper, growing quiet as snow in the space between them. The next days brought a parade of needs. Word spread that the Hayes cabin had supplies and helping hands. They sheltered the widow Patterson when her chimney collapsed, shared food with the Olson family when theirs ran out. Daniel chopped wood for those too old or sick to manage, while Emily made soup from their dwindling stores, stretching it with water and prayer. "We'll run out," Emily worried, watching their supplies shrink. "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But they need it more. We're strong. We'll manage." And they did. When their own food ran low, neighbors remembered. Miguel brought cornmeal. The widow Patterson shared preserved berries. The Olsons contributed salt pork. What they'd given came back, not as payment, but as community. One night, as another storm threatened, Emily found Daniel staring out at the darkness. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I've lived here 3 years," he said slowly. "But this is the first winter that felt less lonely." Emily understood. The cold still bit. The wind still howled. But inside their small circle of light, something had changed. They were no longer two strangers bound by desperate circumstances. They were partners, facing the harsh world together.
"Thank you,"
she said simply,
"for claiming me, for this."
Daniel turned to her,
and in the firelight she saw something soft in his storm-gray eyes.
"Thank you," he replied.
"For making it a home."
Outside, the winter raged on. Inside, something warmer than fire began to kindle. Not yet love, perhaps, but its promise. They'd survived the storm. Together, they might survive anything. The coyotes sang their winter songs, but Emily no longer heard loneliness in their voices. She heard resilience, community, the fierce joy of creatures who endured. Just like her, just like them. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges. But for now, in the depth of winter, they had enough. Warmth, shelter, purpose, and the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for. A true partnership, forged in hardship and sealed by choice. Spring came slowly to the prairie, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated in patches, revealing brown earth that seemed to breathe with relief. Emily stood in the doorway one morning, watching the sun climb higher than it had in months, feeling something similar in her own chest. A loosening, an awakening. "Planting season soon," Daniel said behind her. He'd been up before dawn as always, checking the tools, preparing. "Ground's almost ready." They worked the plot together as the days warmed. Daniel showed her how to read the soil, how to know when it was neither too wet nor too dry. Emily's hands, once soft as silk, now gripped the hoe with calloused confidence. When she caught sight of them, brown from sun, rough from work, she felt pride rather than shame. In the evenings, after the day's labor, they developed a new ritual. Emily had discovered Daniel couldn't read beyond basic words, a fact he'd hidden with quiet dignity. So she offered a trade. She'd teach him letters if he'd continue teaching her the land's ways. They sat by lamplight, the Bible between them, the only book Daniel owned, Emily guiding his finger along the words, his brow furrowed with concentration, lips moving silently as he sounded out syllables. When he successfully read a full verse aloud, his rare smile transformed his weathered face. "You're a quick student," Emily said one evening after he'd mastered a particularly difficult passage. "Got a good teacher," he replied, then colored slightly at the implied intimacy. These moments accumulated like spring rain, gentle but persistent. The careful distance they'd maintained through winter began to erode. Emily found herself watching for Daniel's return from the fields, listening for his step. Daniel, in turn, began sharing more stories of his childhood on a failing farm, his mother's death when he was 12, the war years he still didn't fully discuss. One night, a late freeze threatened their newly planted crops. They worked side by side through the darkness, covering the tender shoots with whatever they could find, blankets, canvas, even their own coats. When dawn came and the plants had survived, Daniel caught Emily's hands in his, examining the fresh blisters. "You didn't have to," he said softly. "Could have managed alone." "They're our crops," Emily replied. "Our future." The word "our" hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Daniel's thumb brushed across her palm, and Emily felt something electric pass between them. Then a horse whinnied in the distance, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart. But something had shifted. Their accidental touches lingered longer. Their evening lessons moved closer together. When Daniel returned from town with a small packet of flower seeds, "Thought you might like something pretty among all the practical," he'd mumbled. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. She planted them along the cabin wall, morning glories that would climb and bloom, beauty for beauty's sake, the first purely ornamental thing in their hard-scrabble life. Daniel built a small trellis to support them, working with the same care he gave to essential tasks. The community, too, began to shift its perception. At Sunday services held in the schoolhouse, as Cedar Ridge had no proper church, people nodded to them both. Emily was no longer the Carter girl who fell so low, but Mrs. Hayes, who helped during the storm. Women who'd once whispered behind fans now asked her advice on preserving food. Men who'd scorned Daniel as a stable hand now respected him as a landowner, small though his holding was. One afternoon, Rosa Santos visited with her baby, thriving now, fat and laughing. "We named him Daniel," she said shyly, "for the man who saved us, and Emily for the woman who brought him into the world." Emily felt her throat close with emotion. In her father's world, she'd been ornamental, valued for beauty and breeding. Here, she had worth measured in actions, in lives touched. That evening, she found Daniel sitting on the porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. She joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee. She'd finally mastered the art of making it strong without burning it. Rosa came by. She said, "I heard." He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing. "Didn't need to name the boy after me." "Yes, they did." Emily studied his profile, the strong nose, the jaw marked by a small scar, the eyes that saw so much but demanded so little. "You're a good man. Daniel Hayes." He turned to her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "Been wondering," he said slowly. "If, maybe, that is—" He stopped, started again. "You could have done worse, but you also could have done better. Than me. I mean—" Emily set down her cup, turned to face him fully. "How? How could I have done better than a man who gave me shelter without condition, who taught me strength I didn't know I had, who risks himself for neighbors and asks nothing in return? You were meant for more than this." He gestured at the small cabin, the hard land. "I was meant for a cage," Emily corrected. "You gave me sky." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. Inside the cabin, the fire needed tending. Supper needed cooking. But for this moment, they sat in the space between day and night, between what was and what might be. Daniel reached over, tentatively, and took her hand. His was rough, warm, steady. "Emily," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I know we started strange. No, I'm not what you would have chosen, but—" "But," she prompted when he faltered. "But I'm glad," he finished simply. "Glad you're here. Glad we're us." Emily turned his hand over, tracing the lines on his palm, the map of a life lived through work and weather. "I'm glad too," she whispered. They sat holding hands as the stars emerged, one by one. No grand declarations, no passionate embraces, just 2 people choosing each other in the quiet way of growing things. Love arriving not like a prairie storm, but like spring itself, inevitable, patient, worth the wait. Later, as Emily prepared for bed, she heard Daniel below, banking the fire for the night. The sounds of his routine had become the rhythm of her life. She thought of her father's house, of the suitors she'd refused, of the girl who'd stood at that window watching dust and whispers. That girl would be horrified by her rough hands, her simple clothes, her hard life. But that girl had never known the satisfaction of seeds becoming shoots, of neighbors becoming family, of a quiet man's smile when he successfully read a difficult word. That girl had never felt her heart race from the brush of work-worn fingers or found beauty in the sight of morning glories climbing toward the sun. "Emily," Daniel's voice came soft from below. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she called back. "Everything's good." And it was. Not perfect. They still had little money. The work never ended. And summer would bring its own challenges. But good in the way of real things. Solid things. Things built by choice and sustained by growing affection. She heard Daniel settle onto his pallet. He still slept by the stove, though the nights were warmer now. But the distance between them had become something different. Not the careful space between strangers, but the respectful pause between 2 people approaching something precious, something that deserved patience. The coyotes called in the distance, but their song had changed with the season. Where winter brought lonely howls, spring carried something else, mate calls, pack songs, the sound of creatures no longer alone. Emily smiled in the darkness, understanding the feeling. Tomorrow would bring more work weeding, watering, the endless tasks of making life from land. But tomorrow would also bring Daniel's quiet presence, their evening lessons, the slow bloom of morning glories and something deeper, love growing steady as crops, strong as prairie grass, sure as the sun that would rise over their small but expanding world. In the corner of the cabin, she'd hung the blue dress from her wedding day. She'd thought to alter it for everyday wear, but now it seemed right to leave it as it was, a reminder of endings that became beginnings, of the day she'd traded everything she'd known for everything she'd needed. Outside, a nightingale began to sing, welcoming the spring with liquid notes of joy. Emily listened, feeling her own heart echo the song. She'd found her voice here, not in words but in actions, in choices, in the quiet revolution of a woman claiming her own life, and in the growing certainty that when she'd said, "I do," in that cold church, fate had given her more than either of them had dared to hope for, not just a husband, but a partner, not just a shelter, but a home, not just survival, but the tentative, precious beginning of love. Summer brought the town's social, an annual event where Cedar Ridge pretended civilization had fully taken root in the wild prairie. Emily heard about it from Rosa Santos during a visit. There would be music, dancing, food, and everyone would attend in their finest clothes. "You'll come?" "Yes," Rosa asked eagerly. "Is important, showing the town you belong." Emily hesitated. She'd avoided town beyond necessary trips for supplies, unwilling to face the stares and whispers. But Daniel, overhearing from the garden, appeared in the doorway. "We'll be there," he said firmly. When Rosa left, Emily turned to him in surprise. "I have nothing suitable to wear," she began. "Then we'll make do with what we have." Daniel replied, "You've nothing to be ashamed of. Emily, let them see what I see, a woman worth 10 of their pampered daughters." The words warmed her more than the summer sun, but as the social approached, anxiety gnawed at her. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge. Everyone would know the former Emily Carter was coming to town as the stable-hand's wife. The day of the social dawned bright and hot. Emily wore her best dress, one of Martha's practical gifts, made prettier with some lace she'd salvaged from her wedding dress. Daniel had trimmed his beard, worn his good shirt. They looked respectable, if not prosperous. The ride to town felt both too long and too short. Emily's hands trembled as they neared the decorated square, where tables groaned with food and bunting fluttered in the breeze. She could see the crowd, hear the fiddle music, feel the weight of impending judgment. "We don't have to stay long," Daniel murmured, helping her down from the wagon. "Just show face. Be polite. Leave when you're ready." But as they entered the square, the reaction wasn't quite what Emily expected. Yes, there were stares, some whispers behind hands, but Rosa Santos rushed over, pulling them toward her family's table. The widow Patterson nodded warmly. Even some who'd shunned her before offered cautious greetings. Then Emily saw them, her father and Thomas, standing near the platform where the town council held court. Samuel Carter looked older, grayer, his commanding presence somehow diminished. Thomas caught her eye and started forward, but their father's hand on his arm stopped him. "Emily!" The voice came from behind. She turned to find Harrison Wells, the man whose proposal had started everything. He looked prosperous as ever in his fine suit, but his eyes held something like respect. "Mrs. Hayes," he corrected himself. "I hear you helped many during the winter storms." "We did what neighbors do," Emily replied carefully. "Indeed." Harrison glanced at Daniel, who stood quietly watchful beside her. "I misjudged things. I think you seem well-suited." Before Emily could respond, Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the square. "Friends, neighbors, let's have some dancing musicians. Strike up a reel." The crowd began forming sets for the dance. Emily started to retreat, but Daniel caught her elbow gently. Would you honor me with a dance, Mrs. Hayes?" She stared at him.
"You dance?"
A small smile played at his lips. "Army taught me many things, some more useful than others." They joined a set, and to Emily's amazement, Daniel moved with unexpected grace. He guided her through the steps with the same patient confidence he brought to teaching her farm work. Around them, other couples whirled and stepped, but Emily found her focus narrowing to Daniel's hand at her waist, his eyes steady on hers.
"People are watching,"
she murmured as they passed close in the dance. "Let them," he replied. "They're seeing a man dancing with his wife. Nothing scandalous in that." But there was something scandalous in the way her heart raced, in the heat that had nothing to do with summer, in the realization that she wanted this, not just the dance, but the man holding her as if she were precious. When the music ended, they were near the refreshment table. Emily reached for water, parched from dancing and emotion. That's when she heard the voice that still had power to wound. "Well, daughter, you look robust." Samuel Carter stood before them, Thomas hovering uncertainly behind. Her father's eyes swept over her sun-browned skin, her work-roughened hands, her simple dress.
"Father,"
Emily kept her voice level, though her stomach churned. "I suppose you're satisfied." Samuel continued, ignoring Daniel entirely. "Living in squalor, working like a common laborer. Was your pride worth this?" Emily felt Daniel tense beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward.
"Yes,"
she said clearly.
"It was worth this. Worth learning my own strength. Worth discovering kindness you never showed. Worth finding a man who values me for more than my ability to be decorative."
Samuel's face darkened. "You forget yourself."
"No,"
Emily's voice rang out, drawing attention from nearby listeners.
"I remember myself. For the first time in my life, I know who I am. I'm Emily Hayes. I help my neighbors. I grow food with my own hands. I teach children their letters. I am loved for what I do, not what I represent."
"Loved," Samuel scoffed. "By whom, this stable hand who—"
"By me."
Daniel's voice cut through, quiet but firm. He stepped beside Emily, not in front of her, but beside her, equal. "I love your daughter, Mr. Carter, more than you ever did. I see her courage, her compassion, her strength, things you tried to break but only made stronger." The words hung in the summer air like a declaration of war. Emily turned to Daniel in wonder. He'd never said the word love before, never declared anything so openly. His face was flushed but determined, jaw set as he faced down the man who'd once employed him. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, looked between them with something like bewilderment. "This is what you choose?" he asked Emily. "This life, this man?"
"Yes,"
Emily said simply.
"Every day, I choose this."
Thomas pushed past their father then, reaching for Emily's hands. "I'm glad," he said quickly, quietly. "You look happy. Really happy. I'm glad." Before Samuel could berate him, Judge Morrison appeared, jovial from whiskey and summer heat. "Carter, good to see you. And young Hayes, heard good things about you folks. That was fine dancing. Fine indeed." The judge's approval carried weight. Others began approaching, including some who'd been cool before. The minister's wife complimented Emily's dress. The schoolmaster thanked her for teaching the Santos children their letters. Slowly, incrementally, the tide turned. Samuel left without another word, Thomas throwing one last supportive glance over his shoulder. Emily watched them go, waiting for regret or sadness. Instead, she felt only relief, like setting down a burden she'd carried too long. "You all right?" Daniel asked softly. Emily looked at him, this man who'd stood as her equal, who'd declared his love not in private but before the town that had scorned them both. "You love me." Color crept up his neck. Shouldn't have said it like that, not in front of everyone.
But seeing him dismiss you, diminish you, couldn't stand it. Daniel, she caught his hands, not caring who saw. I'm glad you said it, because I love you too. Not from gratitude or proximity or having no choice. I love you for who you are. His eyes widened, then softened with wonder. Around them, the social continued. Music and laughter and summer celebration, but in their small circle, something momentous had shifted. Love declared. Love returned. Love chosen freely despite everything that had tried to prevent it. Want to dance again? Daniel asked, thumb brushing over her knuckles. Always, Emily replied. They rejoined the dancing, and this time Emily felt the difference. They moved not as stable hand and fallen lady, but as husband and wife, partners and true. The whispers continued, but their tone had changed. Where once there was scandal, now there was something else, perhaps envy, perhaps recognition that the forced marriage had become something real. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Emily and Daniel made their rounds, saying farewells. People shook Daniel's hand, pressed preserves into Emily's arms, made plans for barn raisings and harvest help. They were part of the community now, woven into its fabric through shared hardship and mutual aid. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. But when they reached the cabin, Daniel helped Emily down and held her a moment longer than necessary. "Meant it," he said, "every word." "I know," Emily replied. "So did I." They stood in the dooryard, moths dancing around the lantern Daniel had left burning. Morning glories closed for the night, but ready to bloom again with dawn. It wasn't the life Emily had imagined as a girl, but it was the life she'd chosen as a woman. And choosing, she'd learned, made all the difference. That night, as Daniel began setting up his pallet by the stove, Emily caught his hand. "It's summer," she said softly. "Plenty warm. The stove doesn't need tending." He looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Emily, we don't have to—" "I know," she interrupted. "But I want my husband beside me, if you're willing." Daniel's answer was to gather his things and follow her up to the loft. They lay side by side in the darkness, not touching yet, but aware of each other's breathing, each other's warmth. It was enough for now, this new closeness, this mutual choosing, this love that had grown from duty into something deeper. Outside, coyotes sang their night songs. Inside, two people who'd found each other through the strangest circumstances settled into sleep, no longer alone. The morning would bring work and challenges, but it would also bring the certainty of partnership, of love declared and returned, of a future they would build together by choice. Summer brought the town social, an annual event where Cedar Ridge pretended civilization had fully taken root in the wild prairie. Emily heard about it from Rosa Santos during a visit. There would be music, dancing, food, and everyone would attend in their finest clothes. "You'll come?" "Yes," Rosa asked eagerly. "Is important, showing the town you belong." Emily hesitated. She'd avoided town beyond necessary trips for supplies, unwilling to face the stares and whispers. But Daniel, overhearing from the garden, appeared in the doorway. "We'll be there," he said firmly. When Rosa left, Emily turned to him in surprise. "I have nothing suitable to wear." She began. "Then we'll make do with what we have," Daniel replied. "You've nothing to be ashamed of. Emily, let them see what I see, a woman worth 10 of their pampered daughters." The words warmed her more than the summer sun. But as the social approached, anxiety gnawed at her. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge. Everyone would know the former Emily Carter was coming to town as the stable-hand's wife. The day of the social dawned bright and hot. Emily wore her best dress, one of Martha's practical gifts, made prettier with some lace she'd salvaged from her wedding dress. Daniel had trimmed his beard, worn his good shirt. They looked respectable, if not prosperous. The ride to town felt both too long and too short.
Emily's hands trembled as they neared the decorated square, where tables groaned with food and bunting fluttered in the breeze. She could see the crowd, hear the fiddle music, feel the weight of impending judgment. "We don't have to stay long," Daniel murmured, helping her down from the wagon. "Just show face, be polite, leave when you're ready." But as they entered the square, the reaction wasn't quite what Emily expected. Yes, there were stares, some whispers behind hands, but Rosa Santos rushed over, pulling them toward her family's table. The widow Patterson nodded warmly. Even some who'd shunned her before offered cautious greetings. Then Emily saw them, her father and Thomas, standing near the platform where the town council held court. Samuel Carter looked older, grayer, his commanding presence somehow diminished. Thomas caught her eye and started forward, but their father's hand on his arm stopped him. "Emily!" The voice came from behind. She turned to find Harrison Wells, the man whose proposal had started everything. He looked prosperous as ever in his fine suit, but his eyes held something like respect. "Mrs. Hayes," he corrected himself. "I hear you helped many during the winter storms." "We did what neighbors do," Emily replied carefully. "Indeed." Harrison glanced at Daniel, who stood quietly watchful beside her. "I misjudged things. I think you seem well-suited." Before Emily could respond, Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the square. "Friends, neighbors, let's have some dancing musicians. Strike up a reel." The crowd began forming sets for the dance. Emily started to retreat, but Daniel caught her elbow gently. "Would you honor me with a dance, Mrs. Hayes?" She stared at him. "You dance." A small smile played at his lips. "Army taught me many things, some more useful than others." They joined a set, and to Emily's amazement, Daniel moved with unexpected grace. He guided her through the steps with the same patient confidence he brought to teaching her farm work. Around them, other couples whirled and stepped, but Emily found her focus narrowing to Daniel's hand at her waist, his eyes steady on hers. "People are watching," she murmured as they passed close in the dance. "Let them," he replied. "They're seeing a man dancing with his wife. Nothing scandalous in that." But there was something scandalous in the way her heart raced, in the heat that had nothing to do with summer, in the realization that she wanted this, not just the dance, but the man holding her as if she were precious. When the music ended, they were near the refreshment table. Emily reached for water, parched from dancing and emotion. That's when she heard the voice that still had power to wound. "Well, daughter, you look robust." Samuel Carter stood before them, Thomas hovering uncertainly behind. Her father's eyes swept over her sun-browned skin, her work-roughened hands, her simple dress. "Father," Emily kept her voice level, though her stomach churned. "I suppose you're satisfied." Samuel continued, ignoring Daniel entirely. "Living in squalor, working like a common laborer. Was your pride worth this?" Emily felt Daniel tense beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. "Yes," she said clearly, "it was worth this, worth learning my own strength, worth discovering kindness you never showed, worth finding a man who values me for more than my ability to be decorative." Samuel's face darkened. "You forget yourself." "No." Emily's voice rang out, drawing attention from nearby listeners. "I remember myself. For the first time in my life, I know who I am. I'm Emily Hayes. I help my neighbors. I grow food with my own hands. I teach children their letters. I am loved for what I do, not what I represent." "Loved," Samuel scoffed. "By whom, this stable hand who?" "By me." Daniel's voice cut through, quiet but firm. He stepped beside Emily. Not in front of her, but beside her, equal. "I love your daughter, Mr. Carter, more than you ever did. I see her courage, her compassion, her strength. things you tried to break but only made stronger. The words hung in the summer air like a declaration of war. Emily turned to Daniel in wonder. He'd never said the word love before, never declared anything so openly. His face was flushed but determined, jaws set as he faced down the man who'd once employed him. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, looked between them with something like bewilderment. "This is what you choose?" he asked Emily. "This life, this man?"
"Yes,"
Emily said simply.
"every day. I choose this."
Thomas pushed past their father then, reaching for Emily's hands. "I'm glad," he said quickly, quietly. "You look happy. Really happy. I'm glad." Before Samuel could berate him, Judge Morrison appeared, jovial from whiskey and summer heat. "Carter, good to see you. And young Hayes. Heard good things about you folks. That was fine dancing. Fine indeed." The judge's approval carried weight. Others began approaching, including some who'd been cool before. The minister's wife complimented Emily's dress. The schoolmaster thanked her for teaching the Santos children their letters. Slowly, incrementally, the tide turned. Samuel left without another word, Thomas throwing one last supportive glance over his shoulder. Emily watched them go, waiting for regret or sadness. Instead, she felt only relief, like setting down a burden she'd carried too long. "You all right?" Daniel asked softly. Emily looked at him, this man who'd stood as her equal, who'd declared his love not in private but before the town that had scorned them both. "You love me." Color crept up his neck. Shouldn't have said it like that, not in front of everyone, but seeing him dismiss you, diminish you, couldn't stand it.
"Daniel."
She caught his hands, not caring who saw. "I'm glad you said it, because I love you too. Not from gratitude or proximity or having no choice. I love you for who you are." His eyes widened, then softened with wonder. Around them, the social continued, music and laughter and summer celebration, but in their small circle, something momentous had shifted. Love declared. Love returned. Love chosen freely despite everything that had tried to prevent it. "Want to dance again?" Daniel asked, thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Always," Emily replied. They rejoined the dancing, and this time Emily felt the difference. They moved not as stable hand and fallen lady, but as husband and wife, partners in true. The whispers continued, but their tone had changed. Where once there was scandal, now there was something else. Perhaps envy. Perhaps recognition that the forced marriage had become something real. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Emily and Daniel made their rounds. Saying farewells, people shook Daniel's hand, pressed preserves into Emily's arms, made plans for barn raisings and harvest help. They were part of the community now, woven into its fabric through shared hardship and mutual aid. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. But when they reached the cabin, Daniel helped Emily down and held her a moment longer than necessary. "Meant it," he said, every word.
"I know,"
Emily replied.
"So did I."
They stood in the dooryard, moths dancing around the lantern Daniel had left burning. Morning glories closed for the night but ready to bloom again with dawn. It wasn't the life Emily had imagined as a girl, but it was the life she'd chosen as a woman. And choosing, she'd learned, made all the difference. That night, as Daniel began setting up his pallet by the stove, Emily caught his hand. "It's summer," she said softly. "Plenty warm. The stove doesn't need tending." He looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Emily, we don't have to—"
"I know,"
she interrupted.
"But I want my husband beside me. If you're willing."
Daniel's answer was to gather his things and follow her up to the loft. They lay side by side in the darkness, not touching yet, but aware of each other's breathing, each other's warmth. It was enough for now, this new closeness, this mutual choosing, this love that had grown from duty into something deeper. Outside, coyotes sang their night songs. Inside, two people who'd found each other through the strangest circumstances settled into sleep. No longer alone, the morning would bring work and challenges, but it would also bring the certainty of partnership, of love declared and returned, of a future they would build together by choice. The harvest season brought golden light and busy days. Emily and Daniel worked side by side in the small field, cutting wheat, binding sheaves, racing against the weather. Their movements had found rhythm over the months. Where one flagged, the other stepped forward. Wordless communication born of shared labor. The makeshift school had grown from Emily teaching the Santos children to a proper class of 8. Parents who'd once scorned her now entrusted her with their children's education. She held lessons in the cool of morning before fieldwork, using whatever materials she could find, charcoal on flat stones when slate was scarce, arithmetic learned by counting seeds and dividing preserves.
Mrs. Hayes, will you teach us to read like Mr.
Hayes, little Anna Olson asked one morning, having heard that Daniel now read scripture at Sunday gatherings.
Would you like that?
Emily asked, warmth flooding through her at the pride in the child's voice when speaking of Daniel. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A woman approached on foot, her fine clothes dusty from the road, her face hidden by a traveling bonnet. Only when she stood before their door did Emily recognize her. Mother. Margaret Carter had aged in the years since Emily had seen her. Her carefully arranged hair showed more gray. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached toward her daughter.
May I come in?
Emily stood frozen until Daniel appeared behind her, flour on his hands from the bread he'd been making. Mrs. Carter, he said quietly. You're welcome here. The word welcome broke Emily's paralysis. She stepped aside, letting her mother enter the cabin that was so different from the grand house she'd known. Margaret's eyes took in everything, the simple furniture, the clean swept floor, the books on the shelf Daniel had built, the curtains Emily had sewn from feed sacks. When her gaze fell on the morning glories blooming outside the window, she made a soft sound.
You planted flowers, she murmured. You always loved flowers. Daniel brought me seeds,
Emily said, the words feeling strange. This formal woman was her mother, yet felt like a stranger. Margaret sat carefully on the bench by the table. I've wanted to come for months. Your father forbade it, but he's in Denver on business. And I had to see you. Daniel quietly excused himself to tend the animals, leaving mother and daughter alone. The silence stretched, filled with years of things unsaid.
Are you well?
Margaret finally asked. Truly. Emily looked at her mother, really looked at her, saw the lines of worry, the careful hope, the fear of rejection.
Yes, Mother, I'm well. I'm happy.
With him, the stable hand.
With my husband,
Emily corrected gently.
Who has shown me more kindness and respect than Father ever did.
Margaret flinched but didn't protest. Instead, she pulled a small packet from her bag.
I thought you might.
She trailed off, pushing the packet across the table. Inside were seeds, not vegetable seeds, but flowers, roses, lavender, sweet peas, beautiful, impractical things, and beneath them, wrapped in tissue, her mother's pearl hair combs, the ones Emily had admired as a child. Mother, I can't.
Please.
Margaret's composure cracked.
I failed you. Emily, I let your father's will override my own for too many years. I stood silent when I should have spoken. They're all I can give you now. Beauty for your new life. Something of me to remember that I love you.
Emily felt tears threaten. She came around the table, knelt beside her mother's chair. I never doubted you loved me, but love isn't always enough, is it?
No, Margaret whispered. But it should be. What I see here, this is love enough. The way that man looked at you, the way you speak of him, the home you've made, The children I passed playing in your yard, calling you Mrs. Hayes with such affection. This is love made manifest."
They talked then, really talked, as they never had in the grand house. Margaret shared news of Thomas, who'd begun standing up to their father, of changes in town, of people who asked after Emily with genuine interest rather than malicious gossip. Harrison Wells married the younger girl from Cheyenne. Margaret said, "A business arrangement. They seem cordial. Nothing more." She paused. "Nothing like what you have here." When Daniel returned, he brought fresh milk and quiet dignity. He served Margaret as carefully as he would any honored guest, and Emily watched her mother slowly relax, saw her recognize the gentle strength in this man society had deemed beneath them. As afternoon waned, Margaret rose to leave. "I must return before dark, but Emily, could I visit again?" Emily looked at Daniel, who nodded slightly. "You're always welcome. Mother, our door is open to you." "At the gate." Margaret turned back. "That first winter, when the storms came, people talked about how you two helped everyone, risked yourselves for neighbors. I was so proud, Emily, so proud of who you've become." After she left, Emily stood in the dooryard, holding the packet of seeds. Daniel came beside her, solid and warm. "You all right?" "She defied him to come here," Emily said wonderingly. "My mother, who never defied anyone, rode alone across the prairie to see me." "Love makes people brave," Daniel said simply. "Look what it's done to us." That evening, they planted the flower seeds together, Daniel digging, Emily placing each one carefully. As they worked, neighbors began arriving, the informal gathering that had become weekly tradition. Rosa brought cornbread. The Olsons contributed preserved berries. Widow Patterson carried her mending to work while they talked. The school became the topic of discussion. More families wanted to send their children, but the cabin was too small for proper lessons. "Could build something," Miguel suggested. "If we all pitched in, proper schoolhouse." "I've got timber from clearing the backfield," another neighbor offered. "Been wondering what to do with it." And so it grew, from suggestion to plan. The community that had once shunned Emily now rallied around the school she'd started. Daniel sketched rough plans by lamplight while Emily calculated what they'd need for supplies. "Look at you," Widow Patterson said fondly. "From society lady to frontier teacher, your father must be spitting nails." "Let him," Emily said with more peace than defiance. "I've found my place." As the evening wound down and neighbors departed, Daniel and Emily cleaned up together, movements coordinated from practice. The cabin felt full even after everyone left, full of warmth, purpose, belonging. "Your mother was right," Daniel said suddenly. "About love made manifest, that's what we're building here." Emily dried the last dish, hung the cloth carefully. "Is that enough? This small life, these simple things?" Daniel turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. "Emily, you've created more in 1 year than some manage in a lifetime. A home from a house, a community from strangers, a school from nothing but will and chalk. If that's not enough, I don't know what is." She leaned into him, feeling the solid truth of his presence. Outside, nightbirds called and wind rustled the wheat they'd soon harvest. Inside, lamplight made gold of common things. The table where they'd shared countless meals. The books that bridged their different worlds. The flowers blooming beyond the window. "I love you," she said, words that still felt new and precious. "For seeing me when others saw only scandal. For teaching me strength. For standing beside me instead of in front of me." "I love you," he replied. "For choosing to stay when you could have run. For making this cabin a home. For showing me that some chances are worth taking." They stood together in the lamplight, no longer the desperate couple forced together by cruel circumstance, but partners who'd chosen each other again and again through every challenge. Tomorrow would bring the harvest, the school building, the continued work of making life from the prairie. But tonight, they had this love spoken and returned, community embraced and embracing them back, a mother's blessing, and the certainty that what they'd built would stand against whatever came. The morning glories would bloom again tomorrow, reaching always toward the light, just as they had learned to do. The coyotes sang in the darkness, but their song had become familiar, almost comforting. Emily and Daniel climbed to their bed together, no longer strangers or even newlyweds, but something deeper. Two people who'd found home in each other and built from that foundation something neither could have imagined alone. The stars wheeled overhead. The prairie stretched endless, but their world had become exactly the right size, big enough for dreams, small enough for love, perfect for the life they'd chosen to create together. Spring returned like an old friend, bringing warmth to the prairie and new life to the Hayes homestead. Emily stood in the doorway of the completed schoolhouse, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching children scatter homeward after lessons. The building stood proud against the sky and testimony to what a community could achieve together. Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes. Young Thomas Santos ran back, clutching his slate. Look, I wrote my whole name. Emily smiled, kneeling carefully to admire his work. Excellent penmanship. Thomas, your mother will be so proud. The boy beamed and raced off. Daniel appeared from behind the schoolhouse where he'd been repairing a loose board, sawdust in his hair and that quiet smile she'd come to cherish. How are you feeling? He asked, hand coming naturally to support her elbow as she straightened. Like I swallowed a watermelon. Emily laughed, then winced as the baby kicked. An active watermelon. They walked home slowly, Daniel matching her pace. The cabin had grown too, a proper bedroom added for the coming child. A larger porch where evening gatherings could spill outside. The morning glories climbed higher than ever, now joined by her mother's roses, finally blooming after a year of patient tending. Letter came while you were teaching, Daniel said, producing an envelope from his pocket. From your mother. Emily opened it eagerly. Margaret wrote weekly now, defying Samuel's continued displeasure. This letter held unexpected news. Thomas was engaged to a merchant's daughter from Denver, a love match he'd fought for despite their father's preference for a wealthier connection. He writes that our example gave him courage. Emily read aloud. That seeing our happiness made him believe love was worth fighting for. That evening brought the usual gathering, expanded now to include new homesteaders drawn by tales of the helpful community. The schoolhouse had become Cedar Ridge's pride, drawing families who might have settled elsewhere. Emily watched from the porch as neighbors shared food and stories, Daniel among them, no longer the silent stable hand but a respected voice in planning and decisions. Never thought I'd see the day, said a familiar voice. Emily turned to find Martha Palmer climbing the porch steps, gray hair neat beneath her bonnet. Martha, how wonderful! Emily stopped, noticing the valise at Martha's feet. Are you... Left his employ this morning, Martha said with satisfaction. After 20 years, told Samuel Carter I was too old to serve a man who'd cast out his own daughter for finding happiness. Thought maybe you could use help when the baby comes. Emily felt tears threaten. We can't pay much. Don't need much, just a place to belong, if you'll have me. Of course we'll have you, Daniel said, appearing with remarkable timing. Family doesn't always come by blood. As night fell and neighbors departed, Emily found herself in the garden with Daniel, checking the plants by moonlight. It was here, among growing things, that they often talked most freely. Are you happy? She asked suddenly. Truly, this isn't the life you planned either. Daniel considered, hands gentle on a tomato vine. Planned to work other men's land my whole life. Planned to stay quiet, invisible, alone. Then you came along and changed everything. He turned to her, moonlight silvering his features. Emily, I wake every morning grateful. For you, for this land, for the child coming, for the 1,000 small miracles I never thought I'd have. Even when I burned the bread yesterday,
Especially then, he teased. Keeps me humble, knowing my brilliant teacher wife can't master a simple oven. She swatted him playfully, then grew serious. I never thanked you properly for claiming me that day, for saving me from— You saved yourself, Daniel interrupted. I just offered a door. You're the one who walked through it and made something beautiful on the other side. The baby kicked again, and Daniel's hand joined hers on her belly, feeling the movement. Wonder crossed his face, as it did every time. What should we name him? Emily asked. Or her? Something strong, Daniel said. Something free, like their mother. 2 weeks later, as dawn broke over the prairie, Emily brought their daughter into the world with Martha's capable help and Daniel's steady presence. The baby announced herself with lusty cries that made everyone laugh through their tears. Hope, Emily whispered, looking into the tiny face that somehow held both her features and Daniel's. Hope Margaret Hayes. Hope, Daniel repeated, cradling his daughter like she was made of spun glass. Perfect. The community celebrated as if Hope were everyone's child. Food appeared daily. Neighbors took turns with chores. The school ran on a volunteer basis until Emily recovered. Even Judge Morrison visited, bringing an unexpected gift, a savings bond in Hope's name. For her education, he said gruffly. Town needs educated women. Your teachings prove that much. But the greatest surprise came a month after Hope's birth. Emily was nursing the baby on the porch when a carriage approached, too fine for their usual visitors. Her breath caught as Samuel Carter descended, looking older, smaller somehow. Daniel emerged from the barn, moving protectively closer, but Samuel raised a hand. I come in peace, to meet my granddaughter, if you'll allow it. Emily looked at Daniel, who nodded slightly. Her choice, as always. You may meet her, father, but know this, you meet her as Hope Hayes, daughter of people you scorned. If you cannot respect that, you're not welcome here. Samuel's jaw worked, pride warring with something else. Finally, he nodded. Emily let him hold Hope, watched as the baby's tiny fingers gripped his thumb, saw something crack in her father's stern facade. She's beautiful, he said roughly. Like her mother, like— He cleared his throat. I was wrong. Emily, about many things. Your mother told me. She said you've built something here, something real. I didn't believe her until I saw for myself. He gestured at the thriving homestead, the schoolhouse visible in the distance, the obvious contentment in his daughter's face. You've made me a fool. Girl, proved that everything I valued meant less than what I scorned. I've proved nothing except that love matters more than position, Emily said gently. That Daniel is worth a dozen society men. That community means more than status. These aren't new truths. Father, they're old ones you forgot. Samuel stayed an hour, holding his granddaughter, speaking carefully to Daniel about crop yields and land management, the only common ground he could find. When he left, he pressed an envelope into Emily's hands. Your mother fights me daily to visit more. Perhaps I'll occasionally accompany her, if that's acceptable. After he gone, Emily opened the envelope. Inside was a deed to the 20 acres adjoining their land, her father's way of apologizing, of acknowledging what words couldn't say. We don't need his land, Daniel said, reading over her shoulder. No, Emily agreed. But we could use it. Build more for Hope, for other children God might send. Expand the school. Create something lasting. That evening, as spring rain pattered gently on the roof, Emily rocked Hope while Daniel read aloud from the Bible, his reading smooth now, confident. Martha dozed by the fire, truly home at last. Listen, Daniel said suddenly, setting the book aside. Through the rain came singing their neighbors, gathered despite weather for their weekly meeting. Voices raised in harmony, celebrating nothing more than being together, being community, being family chosen by heart rather than blood.
Emily looked around the cabin that had once seemed so small and poor. Now it overflowed with richness that had nothing to do with money. Love lived in every corner. Hope bloomed with every flower. Faith grew with every planted seed.
"I choose you,"
she whispered to Daniel as he took Hope, settling the baby with practiced ease.
"Every day, in every way. I choose this life we've built."
"And I choose you," he replied, free arm drawing her close.
"My Emily, my teacher, my partner, my love, mother of my child, builder of dreams I didn't know I could have."
Outside, the coyotes added their wild music to the human voices. The prairie stretched endless under spring rain, promising growth, challenge, and beauty in equal measure. But inside the cabin, the Hayes family rested complete, not ended but beginning, not settled but ready for whatever came next. The morning glories would bloom again tomorrow, reaching for light as they always did, and hope would grow in this place of second chances, surrounded by love that had transformed duty into choice, strangers into family, and a forced marriage into the greatest freedom Emily had ever known. Here, in this small cabin on the vast prairie, they had found their happily ever after, not in fairy tale perfection, but in the daily choice to love, to build, to hope. And that, Emily knew as she drifted towards sleep, was the greatest love story of all, the one you wrote yourself, day by day, with hands willing to work and hearts brave enough to choose. The end. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what touched your heart in Emily and Daniel's journey.